How we doing, everyone? So I'm going to give you a little bit of a review on our macromolecules today. I'm going to go over each of the 4 macromolecules. Now, I'm going to kind of go backward here a little bit because the next video I'm going to talk about carbon, but just as kind of a prelude to that, every single one of our macromolecules are going to be made out of carbon along with some other elements, okay? Now, we are humans. Carbon is the basic element that pretty much makes up our body. We are carbon-based organisms. So like I said, each one of these is going to have carbon in them, but we're going to differentiate between them. So there's going to be other elements surrounding that carbon, right? So let me start off with carbohydrates. So let me explain to you what carbohydrates are first. Now, most of these are going to be kind of like foods we eat and things that make up our body, except for nucleic acids. Nucleic acids really aren't a food. But carbohydrates, our first one, these are going to be all the sugars that we eat. So carbohydrates is pretty much anything that is going to contain sugar. Now, there's 3 carbohydrates that we're going to talk about later on when I go over the monomer. But let me just explain the structure first. Anytime you see a chemical formula for a carbohydrate, it's always going to follow this structure. It's going to be made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And it's always going to be in a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. So for every 1 carbon there's going to be 2 hydrogens, and there's also going to be 1 oxygen. So I can go and give you an example of this, where we have C6, okay? So if I have 6 carbons, my hydrogen is going to be 2 times that number, which is going to be 12. And then my O is just going to be that same number as our carbon, which is 6, okay? And that's pretty much it for the structure. Anytime you see the 1 to 2 to 1 ratio, it's always going to be a carbohydrate. For our carbohydrates, guys, if it's not in that format, it's not a carbohydrate, okay? In carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, only 3 elements we're going to find. Our function, so what do we use carbohydrates for? This is going to be short-term energy. Okay? So you're playing sports, you eat carbohydrates beforehand, you're going to burn most of those carbohydrates while you're playing that sport. Now our next 2 categories, this is going to be the monomer and the polymer. Let me explain to you what the monomer and polymer is for our macromolecules. Let's pretend that we are going to try to make a macromolecule. Now macromolecules are huge, they're gigantic, okay? They are going to be made up of monomers and polymers. So if we have a monomer is simply kind of like this ping pong ball, a single unit that makes up our macromolecule. So the monomer is a single unit, all right? You guys are all students. A general name, if I have a classroom, general name for my class is, hey, it's made up of students, okay? You are the monomer. If I call you a student, that's like kind of saying you are a monomer. Each one of these, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids, they have their own individual name for monomer. So that would be like, okay, like I said, you're all students. That's a basic name for your monomer. If I actually call on you and say, hey, Fred, okay? In other words, I'm calling you by your individual name. That is saying, okay, now I'm getting specific with my monomer. So the monomer of carbohydrates is like your individual name, all right? So for carbohydrates, it's called a monosaccharide. Monosaccharide. So that is our monomer of carbohydrates, okay? Anytime you see the root word saccharose in a word, that means sugar. So saccharose means sugar, okay? Now, this is our monomer, like I said. If we want to get real specific and say, hey, this monomer is dealing with carbohydrates. Now we know this monomer is no longer called a monomer. We can get more specific with it and say this is a monosaccharide. We are going to make a macromolecule, and a macromolecule is millions upon millions of monomers put together. Once we start to put these monosaccharides together, or once we put these monomers together, we now get a polymer. So monomer, monomer, polymer, okay? For our carbohydrates, the polymers, let me draw a little line here in between, we're going to have two of them. So when we put two monosaccharides together, we get a disaccharide, okay? All disaccharide is, guys, boom, two monosaccharides put together. Now we're going to keep putting more and more and more ping pong balls on this growing monosaccharide chain. Once we get to 3, 4, 5, 6, it's no longer called a disaccharide. Di means two. So we call it after that, polysaccharide. Okay, so again, monomer, polymer. Okay, if we're talking about carbohydrates, monosaccharide, monosaccharide, disaccharide, put more on, we get a polysaccharide. Right, and that is pretty much it with carbohydrates, guys. The one other thing I want to mention before we move on is for our monosaccharides, there's three main ones that we will go over with the macromolecules and the ones our body uses. That's glucose. There's also fructose. This is a sugar found in fruit, plants. And then there's also galactose. And galactose is one of the sugars that we find in milk. Okay, so three monosaccharides, the main ones you'll need to know for the keystones: glucose, fructose, and galactose. Okay, so let's move on to lipids. Lipids are almost the same thing as carbohydrates. Our difference is going to be what they are used for. Carbs, we're using as short-term energy. Lipids, we are actually going to store these for later. Lipids are fat, so we're going to store these for later, and these are going to supply us with our long-term energy. In other words, our stored energy. Okay. Now, structure, guess what? It's about the same. It still has carbon, it still has hydrogen, it still has oxygen. Here's going to be the difference. If it is let's say a carbohydrate, I'm going to do 10 carbons. That means I would have 20 hydrogens. Now, if this was a carb, we would have 10 oxygens as well. Here is how we differentiate between if it's a lipid or a carbohydrate. The oxygen is going to be a whole lot less. So there's an example of a lipid for our structure. So still might have that 2-to-1 ratio here between the hydrogen and the carbon, but we're going to have a lot less oxygen on there. Okay. Our monomer. So one piece of a lipid is called a fatty acid. Okay. Now, there are 4 different polymers, and 2 of them are really, really, really important. So we're going to go over the 2 in a little more detail, but for our polymers, we have steroids. These are ones made by our bodies. Our second one, waxes. Third one, triglycerides. And then our fourth one is going to be our phospholipids. Okay. Before I move on to proteins and nucleic acids, let me go over fatty acids here real quick. So, we are going to have a very long chain of carbons, and it's going to be attached to an oxygen, a hydroxyl group over here, okay? The only thing you want to look at for your fatty acids is this carbon chain. You're not worried about anything else, because there's going to be things on the outside of this, guys. There's going to be hydrogens all around. You're only worried about the carbon to the carbon bonds. If you look, and 1 line is a single bond, 2 lines is a double bond, like that one there, and then there could be 3 lines, which is a triple bond, and that's going to be our strongest. These are all covalently bonded together. Okay, so very strong bond, that's a covalent bond. If we have all single bonds in between our carbons, we call this a saturated fat or a saturated fatty acid. Okay? The second you see one of these where it has a double bond in between 2 of the carbons, it is no longer considered a saturated fatty acid. If we have a double bond, it is now an unsaturated fatty acid. So All single bonds, saturated, one double bond, it is now unsaturated, okay? Those are the two different fatty acids you can choose from. Now, I'm gonna get into triglycerides here real quick. So, two different scenarios we can have. In our triglycerides, prefix tri means three. Triglycerides are going to be made up of three fatty acids, so three monomers for lipids. If we have one of them, so I'm only going to draw one fatty acid on here. If we have one fatty acid, like I said, there's going to be three. But if one fatty acid has one double bond in between, it's automatically unsaturated. Even though the other two you might see might be saturated, as long as there's one double bond, it's automatically unsaturated. Let me show you the other one here now, saturated triglyceride. So here's our saturated. We have all single bonds in between our carbons. Now, what's the difference between these two? Well, unsaturated fatty acids, these are ones that are very healthy for you. They come from plants, and at room temperature, they are oils. Saturated, these are ones that are going to come from animals, and at room temperature, they are going to be solids, okay? So these ones are going to be our oils. These ones are going to be our fats, okay? And like I said, these ones are solids. These ones are liquids, okay? So unsaturated triglycerides, healthy for you, come from plants, things like olive oil, peanut oil. Saturated, they're the ones that you might see like on a steak, a big chunk of animal fat on there. Not so healthy, okay? All right, the other polymer I want to go over before we move on to proteins is going to be phospholipids. Now, in a phospholipid, we are going to have two different parts. And this is going to help us make up our cell membrane, make up that covering for our cells. So phospholipids make up our cell membrane. And actually, you have a double layer of phospholipids making up your cell membrane. So in our phospholipid, we're going to have two different parts. We're going to have a head, and then the other part is going to be a tail. Okay? So the head portion of our phospholipid here, this is going to be called a phosphate group. And that phosphate group is going to be hydrophilic. And what hydrophilic means, guys, is if we put it in water, it's going to combine, it's going to mix. All right? The area down here, these two guys, both of them, these are the fatty acid tails. And they are hydrophobic. So if we were to put water in this phospholipid, it would get real close to the phosphate. It would get right up against it. It would flirt with the phosphate a little bit. Down here, if we put water in that area, the water would actually separate from the fatty acid tails, kind of like when you put oil in water. Same concept there, okay? So that is the phospholipid, and we'll be going a little bit more into the phospholipids when we go over the video on the cell membrane and cell membrane transport. Okay, proteins. So far, guys, I think for our lipids, polymers, yeah, they're pretty in-depth. For our proteins, the structure is going to be the most in-depth part throughout this whole chart, okay? So I'm going to skip structure for now. We'll come back to that in a minute. Our function of our proteins. These are going to be building blocks, so they're going to build up other things. And they also deal with energy conservation. All right, and I'll explain what that means in a minute here. Monomer, our monomer of proteins is going to be an amino acid There are 20 of them all together. And let me draw a line here, because this is going to get a little messy. So I want to make sure we stay somewhat organized. So I'm going to draw the polymers down here, guys, because I went a little bit crazy with the polymers for our lipids. But we have two different polymers for our amino acids or our proteins. So when we put two amino acids together, we get a polymer called a dipeptide. So it's almost the same thing that happened with our polymers for carbohydrates. We put two monosaccharides together, we get a disaccharide. More than that, we get a poly. Put two amino acids together, we get a dipeptide. Put more than two amino acids together, and we get a polypeptide. Okay? Now, let's do the structure part. We are going to start with a central carbon. Okay? On the one side of our protein, so coming over here, we're going to have a nitrogen, and we're going to have two hydrogens attached to it. That is going to be called an amino group. An amino group, okay? On the other side, we're going to have a carbon double bonded to an oxygen and then bonded to a OH or a hydroxyl group. And this is called a carboxyl group. All right? Down below the carbon, we're going to have a little hydrogen atom attached. And now above the carbon, we are going to have R. If you look on the periodic table, there is no R on the periodic table, at least an R standing alone. What the R is a variable group, and there's 20 different R's that there could be. So like I said, there's 20 different amino acids. What is different in all those amino acids is the R group, okay? That's going to be different for all 20 of them. Now, if you guys notice, carbohydrates, we had carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Lipids, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Same elements there. Proteins, we still have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, but now we added nitrogen, and sometimes in this R group, we can have sulfur in it as well, every now and again. Okay? So, one thing I want to mention about proteins, guys, there is a special protein called an enzyme. So let me draw an enzyme here. Okay? This is an enzyme. What enzymes do is help us to conserve energy. So on our enzyme here, we have this nice little shape up here, okay? Let's say you are bringing in food to your body. There are enzymes in your saliva, enzymes in your stomach, enzymes in your intestines that are going to help to break down that food. Now the food is going to fit right into the enzyme. Okay? And we're going to call that, and it doesn't always have to be food, it could be something else, it could be another chemical or whatever. It's going to be called the substrate, and it's going to fit right into that area. That area right there, where it fits into, is called the active site. Active site. If we have that active site and it binds correctly like that, later on what's going to happen is the substrate will split in half, okay? Or we could say it'll decompose, right? And these will be our products from the substrate. Now, what this enzymes do is it lowers the amount of energy we need to break and digest our food, which is really good for us because if we can use this enzyme to lower the amount of energy we need, we got a whole lot more energy to do other things later on, okay? And I'll explore enzymes a little bit more later. I'll give you a graph on enzymes, and I think that'll clear them up a little bit more. Okay, but anyway, enzymes, they're a protein, they're made out of amino acids. All right, last macromolecule here. This is going to be our nucleic acids. It's going to be made out of 3 different parts. And I'm not going to draw the structure real in depth here. Okay, so this part right here, this is going to be a nitrogen base. So each nucleic acid is going to have a nitrogen, or some people call it nitrogenous base, over here. Just like in phospholipids, how I showed you that circular area was a phosphate, the nucleic acids also have a phosphate, and then right here, this is going to be a 5-carbon sugar. Now there's different 5-carbon sugars we can choose from. For DNA, it's deoxyribose. For RNA, it is ribose. Okay? Our function of our nucleic acids, these are going to store our genetic information. Okay. Our monomer is going to be a nucleotide. Okay, so monomer, nucleotide, and then our polymer, we're going to have 3 different ones. It could be DNA, it could be RNA, or lastly, it could be a molecule our bodies use for energy called ATP. Okay, so this is everything on the macromolecules, guys. Like I said, I'm going to go over the specific enzymes and proteins a little bit more later, just to give you a better overview on those. All right, we'll do activation energy with that. But make sure, I know a lot of vocab on here, guys, so make sure you know all of the vocab, all the structure of everything with our macromolecules. All right, I'll be back next time, guys. We'll talk more about enzymes and maybe get into a little bit of water. Have a good day.